So as I said I would be reading this book. I first saw this book when I went to my husband's family's house, and there was just this huge bookshelf, and I saw this book, and every time I go there, I just kind of read it. So I imagine their family thinks I'm a freak. Oh well. All right. Can't wait to read this shit. All right. Probably should have been on the page already. All right. A doctor of anger and fear. One night, on the day fascists first altered the direction of my life, I had barely mastered the art of walking. The date was March 15th, 1939. Battalions of German stormtroopers invaded my native Czechoslovakia, escorted Adolf Hitler to Prague Castle, and pushed Europe to the threshold of Second World War. After 10 days in hiding, my parents and I escaped to London. There, we joined Axles from all across Europe in aiding the Allied war effort while awaiting anxiously for the ordeal to end. When after 6 grueling years the Nazis surrendered, we returned home with high hopes, eager to build a new life in a free land. My father continued his career in Czechoslovak foreign service, and for a brief time all was well. Then, in 1948, our country fell under the control of communists. Democracy was shut down, and once more my family was driven into exile. That Armistice Day, we arrived in the United States, where, under the watchful eyes of the Statue of Liberty, we were welcomed as refugees. To protect us and to make my life and those of my sister Kathy, brother John, seem as normal as possible. My parents did not tell us what we would learn only decades later, that 3 of our grandparents and numerous aunts, uncles, and cousins were among the millions of Jews who had died in the ultimate act of fascism, the Holocaust. I was 11 when I came to the United States with no goal more ambitious than to become a typical American teenager. I ditched my European accent, read stacks of comic books, glued my ear to a transistor radio, and became stuck on bubblegum. I did everything I could to fit in, but I could not escape knowing that in our times, even decisions made far away could spell the difference between death and life. On entering high school, I started an international affairs club, named myself president, and provoked discussions about everything from Taoism to Gandhi's concept of Satyagraha, the force which is born of truth and love. My parents cherished the freedoms we found in our adopted country. My father, who quickly established himself as a professor at the University of Denver, wrote books about the perils of tyranny and worried that the Americans were so accustomed to liberty, so very, very free, he wrote, that they might take democracy for granted. After I began a family of my own, my mother called each 4th of July to confirm that her grandchildren were singing patriotic songs and I had been to the parade. There is a tendency among many in the United States to romanticize the years just after World War II, to imagine a time of sky blue innocence when everyone agreed that America was great and each family had a reliable breadwinner, the latest appliances, children who were above average, and a rosy outlook on life. In fact, the Cold War period of increased anxiety in which the lingering shadows of fascism was darkened by another kind of cloud. In my teenage years, due to atomic tests, the radioactive element strontium-90 was found in babies' teeth at 50 times the natural level. Virtually every town had a civil defense warden urging the construction of backyard fallout shelters stocked with canned vegetables, monopoly boards, and cigarettes. Children in big cities were issued metal tags embossed with their names for identification should the worst happen. Growing older, I followed in my father's footsteps and became a professor. Among many specialties, most Eastern Europe, where countries were dismissed as satellites orbiting a totalitarian sun, and where it was widely thought that nothing interesting ever happened and nothing of importance would ever change. Marx's dream of workers' paradise had degenerated into an Orwellian nightmare. Conformity was the highest good. Informants kept watch on every block while countries lived behind barbed wire, and governments insisted that down was up and black was white. Then when change did come, it was with a velocity that amazed. In June 1989, the decade-old demands of dock workers and the inspiration of the Pope born in Waterwitz brought democratic governance to Poland. That October, Hungary became a democratic republic, and in early November, the Berlin Wall was breached. In those miraculous days, our television brought news each morning of what had long seemed impossible. I can still picture the decisive moments my native Czechoslovakia Velvet Revolution, so-called, because it was secured without the widespread cracking of heads or gunfire. The time was a frosty afternoon in late November. In Prague's historical Wenceslas Square, a crowd of 300,000 joyously rattled keys to emulate bells tolling the end of the communist rule. On a balcony overlooked the throng stood Václav Havel, a valiant playwright who 6 months earlier had been a prisoner of conscience, and 5 weeks later would be sworn as president of free Czechoslovakia. In that instance, I was among the many who felt that democracy had aced its severest test. The once mighty USSR, made fragile, became economic weakness and ideological weariness, shattered like a dropped vase on a stone floor. Liberating Ukraine and Caucasus, the Baltics and Central Asia, the nuclear arms race subsided without blowing any of us up to bits. In the East, South Korea, the Philippines, and Indonesia cast off long-time dictators. In the West, Latin America's military rulers made way for elected presidents. In Africa, the freeing of Nelson Mandela, another prisoner who became a president, engendered hopes of a regional renaissance around the globe. Around the globe, countries merited the label democracy, expanded from 35 to more than 100. In January 1991, George W. Bush told Congress that, quote, the end of the Cold War had been a victory for all of humanity, and America's leadership was instrumental in making it possible. Across the Atlantic, Havel added, quote, Europe is attempting to create a historical new kind of order through a process of unification. A Europe in which no more powerful will be able to suppress anyone less powerful, in which will no longer be possible to settle disputes with force. Today, more than a quarter century later, we must ask what has happened to that uplifting vision. What does it seem to be fading instead of becoming more clear? Why, per Freedom House, is democracy now, quote, under assault and in retreat? Why are many people in positions of power seeking to undermine public confidence in elections, the courts, the media, and on the fundamental question of Earth's future, science? Why have such dangerous splits been allowed to develop between rich and poor, urban and rural, those with a higher education and those without? Why has the United States, at least temporarily, abdicated its leadership in the world affairs? And why, this far into the 21st century, are we once again talking about fascism? One reason, frankly, is Donald Trump. If we think of fascism as a wound from the past that had almost healed, putting Trump in the White House was like ripping off the bandage and picking at the scab. Oh, I did not know she was going to bring up Trump. To be honest, I didn't read this too much when I was at my family's house because I didn't really want to be rude. You know, it's not like I read 20 chapters in the book and just avoiding everything around me. Oh, wouldn't that be good if you could just do that and not feel guilty? All right. To the political class of Washington, D.C., Republican, Democrat, and Independent alike, the election of Donald Trump was so startling it would have caused an old-time silent film comedian to clench his hat with both hands, yank it over his ears, leap it in the air, and land flat on his back. The United States has had flawed presidents before. In fact, we have never had any other kind. But we have not had the chief executive in the modern era whose statement and actions are so at odds with democratic ideals. From the early stages of his campaign and right into the Oval Office, Donald Trump has spoken harshly about the institution and principles that make up the foundation of open government. In the process, he has systematically degraded political discourse in the United States, shown an astonishing disregard for facts, libeled his predecessors, threatened to lock up political rivals, referred to mainstream journalists as the enemy of the American people, spread falsehoods about the integrity of the U.S. electoral process, touted mindlessly nationalistic economic and trade policies, vilified immigrants and the countries from which they came, and nurtured a paranoid bigotry toward the followers of one of the world's foremost religions. To officials overseas who have autocratic tendencies, these outbursts are catnip. Instead of challenging anti-democratic forces, Trump is a comfort to them, a provider of excuses. In my travels, I hear the same question all the time. If the President of the United States says the press always lies, how can Vladimir Putin be faulted for making the same claim? If Trump insists that judges are biased and calls the American criminal system a laughingstock, what is to stop an autocratic leader like Duterte of the Philippines from discrediting his own judiciary? If Trump accuses opposition politicians of treason merely for failing to applaud his words, what standing will America have to protest the jailing of prisoners of conscience in other lands? If the leader of the world's most powerful country views life as a dog-eat-dog struggle in which no country can gain except at another's cost, who will carry the banner for the international teamwork when the most intractable problems cannot be resolved by any other way? National leadership have a duty to serve the most interests of their countries. That is truism. When Donald Trump talks about putting America first, he is stating the obvious. No serious politician has proposed putting America second. The goal is not the issue. What separates Trump from other presidents from the Mar trio of Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover is his conception of how America's interests are best advanced. He conceives of the world as a battlefield in which every country is intent on dominating every other, where nations compete like real estate developers to ruin rivals and squeeze every penny out of profit of the deals. Given his life experience, one can see how Trump might think that way, and there are certain cases in international diplomacy and commerce where a clear separation between winner and loser is evident. However, at least since the end of World War II, the United States has championed the view that victories are more readily won and easier to sustain through cooperative action than by nations acting alone. The generation of Franklin Roosevelt and Harriet Truman argued that states would be best by promoting shared security, prosperity, and freedom. The 1947 Marshall Plan, for example, was grounded in a recognition that the American economy would stagnate without European markets able to buy what the U.S. farmers and manufacturers had to sell. This meant that the way to put America first was to help our European and Asian partners rebuild the developed dynamic economies of their own. The same thinking led to Truman's Point 4 program, which made U.S. technical assistance available in Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. A comparable approach was served as well as in the security realm. Presidents from Roosevelt to Obama have sought to help allies protect themselves and to engage in collective defense against common dangers. We did this not in the spirit of charity, but because we had learned the hard way that problems abroad, if unaddressed, could before long imperil us. This job of international leadership is not the kind of assessment one ever finishes. Old dangers rarely go away completely, and new ones appear as regularly as dawn. Dealing with them effectively has never been a matter of just money and might. Countries and people must join forces, and that doesn't happen naturally. Though the United States has made many mistakes in its eventful history, it has retained the ability to mobilize others because its commitment to lead in the direction most want to go, toward liberty, justice, and peace. The issue before us now is whether America can continue to exhibit that brand of leadership under a president who doesn't appear to attach much weight to either international cooperation or democratic values. The answer matters because, although nature abhors a vacuum, fascism welcomes one. I do agree that in some cases America does have to be the necessary evil, because I don't agree that America's mistakes are necessarily mistakes at all. They are like purposeful, and usually, like slavery, for instance, that was not a mistake. That was something we knew what we were doing, and that was something we needed, so, depending what we're talking about, like, there's a lot of shady shit that America just does, on purpose. So, I don't really know what she's talking about in this case. But I do like the last thing she said about nature not liking a vacuum, but fascism loves one. Alright. Not long ago, when I told a friend